Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. You know, back in 1776, a couple of things happened. America was born, plus the publication of Wealth of Nations. You know, Wealth of Nations is the book that the entire neoliberal, neoclassical economic model is based on. And yet, there's nothing in the book that accounts for what happens when the natural resources run out, upon which the entire global economy is based. Stacy Herbert, let's talk about this.
Well, Max, funny you should say that because I have the twin eco disasters in the headline. So the first headline is, if you don't think weather is impacting the jobs market, look at this. Because now the ecological devastation is starting to really impact an already fragile economic system. And if you look at the chart, this is from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and it shows you the annual days off from work in the US because of weather-related events. And as you see in the last 2 years, there's been a surge.
The law of diminishing returns, to put it in economic terms. In other words, the continuation of a busted model, this post-Adam Smithian classical economic model, is run its course. It doesn't work anymore because the resources are running out.
And the one major economy that escaped the economic disaster?
Australia?
That's correct. Well, they are being particularly hit hard by the ecological disasters sweeping the world. Australia unveils flood recovery tax. Remember, this is from a few weeks ago where we had the flooding disasters, which have shut down all the coal mining industry there, and also quite a bit of cotton. Australia has now unveiled a flood tax on higher earners following a warning from Prime Minister Julia Gillard that the deluge will cost Australia 5.6 billion Australian dollars, or 0.5% of GDP.
Well, yeah, that's right. There's huge floods brought on by what's called AGW, anthropomorphic global warming. And now they're paying the cost because there's only so much economic activity you can conduct within the ecological restraint that is Australia. They're flooding out their coal mines, so the price of coal is skyrocketing. They're flooding out the wheat crops, so the price of wheat is skyrocketing. Now they've got fires. They've got huge fires in Australia. Once again, the product of a busted economic model. And nobody in the US or the UK, the primary Anglo-Saxon economies, want to revisit this model and say it's busted. We need a new economic model for the world. They don't want to go there because they know it would require some actual politicking, and we don't have politicians anymore. We have corrupt businessmen.
Most of the major economies, other than Australia, we all suffered major economic financial disasters. And we have now austerity measures being introduced all over the place and increasing taxes to pay for the banking disaster. Well, Australia did escape that. However, they're introducing this tax, but they're also introducing austerity measures in order to pay for the ecological disaster.
Right, and the housing market, which has been hot in Australia, will top out because it's a Ponzi scheme, like the housing market in Canada, which is also based on Canadian tar sands. That's unsustainable. And then you're going to have the central banks in Australia and the central bank in Canada saying, well, we have to keep interest rates low in order to mitigate the catastrophe of the ecology, which of course gives companies who are committing the catastrophe an incentive to commit more catastrophe because their price of funds are artificially kept low. So the central bank should be actually defending the right of the ecology to exist to the extent that it can support human life. But instead, it's been co-opted by the corporations who are leaning on it to keep rates so low as to make their model of anthropomorphic global warming and ecological holocaust and economic catastrophe viable for the next 3 months. Because they only look at the next 3 months. They'll all be wiped out. The populations are all wiped out, including the CEOs who authorized this in the banks.
Now you have half of Queensland's sugarcane crops suffer cyclone damage. So in the last week, you had Cyclone Yasi strike Queensland, the second most expensive disaster cyclone to ever hit Queensland. Now, Australia is the third largest exporter of sugarcane, and 90% of it comes from Queensland. And they're now just assessing the damage, but basically 500 million of the 1 billion in sugarcane produced per year has been wiped out, they think.
Right. We've hit peak sugar. We've hit peak wheat. We've hit peak corn. We definitely have hit peak water. You need water to grow all these crops. You need water to do all that tar sands mining and extraction. You need water, and there's less and less water. And of course, as the ice sheets melt again due to AGW, all that fresh water goes into the salt water. That's even less water.
Of course, there are a lot of people who don't believe in anthropomorphic global warming, and they'll get angry about it. But there were many people who also didn't believe that the Federal Reserve Bank or central bankers could ever, or fiat currencies could ever be bad. And they got very angry too with us when we ever mentioned that. And they didn't protect themselves, and that's fine. And you don't need to protect yourself from these. You can go sit in a floodplain if you want.
Well, this is where Milton Friedman, said there's no free lunch. And yet his model has given rise to the biggest free lunch welfare bums in the world, the energy companies like Exxon and Chevron and these other energy companies. The companies like the Monsanto, for example, that gets a huge subsidy to completely destroy the ability of seeds to reproduce. And it's the ultimate free lunch. But now we're at the end of the free lunch, and nature is saying to the economy of the world, it's time to pay the piper. It's time to pay your bill, and people are squawking. They don't want to pay the bill. But it doesn't mean they're not going to pay the bill. They have to pay the bill one way or another.
Well, the twin eco disasters are also in this headline, Max. Russia follows China in using reserve ratios to curtail inflation threat. The twin eco disasters, number one is the economic disaster caused by the U.S., and that is the U.S. Federal Reserve's plan to buy an additional $600 billion of treasuries, according to Joseph Stiglitz, who was speaking in Moscow last week. He said that countries reliant on natural resources face an onslaught of more capital. In order to prevent this, Russia has had to raise their margin requirements. And also, because of the disasters that I talked about with the fires that swept through Russia in the past year, consumer prices have surged 9.6% from a year earlier, triggered by the worst drought in at least 50 years. Grain costs climbed an annual 70% last month.
This is anthropomorphic global currency war, AGCW. Right, the U.S. is trying to extricate itself from 25 years of a busted financial, monetary, fiscal policy. They're trying to export their problems to the rest of the world by flooding the globe with cash. So China, Russia, and other countries are saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We're going to raise our reserve requirements to keep your speculative anthropomorphic global currency war crisis from hitting our shores. So now we're into World War III, basically, is a currency war. And I coined the phrase currency war, by the way, on this show last year. I want to make that clear because there's somebody else out there claiming that they coined that phrase. I coined that phrase. Who do you think comes up with the poetry of the financial disaster? Me or some guy somewhere? No, it's me.
Well, the twin eco disasters.
I came up with the eco disaster. Who do you think thought of that?
Well, this is again in this next headline. JP Morgan announced today that from now on, they will accept physical gold bullion as collateral. This is a sign of gold's further remonetization in the global financial and monetary system.
Yeah, JP Morgan, you'll accept gold bullion now. Of course you will, because you've got no more room to create fiat, fake, sold, short, naked silver contracts, you bum! You welfare bum! Of course you'll take gold and silver bullion, because that's real money, and you're a fake fraud house of holographic nonsense!
That's raising margin requirements, because, if you lose your money on a margin call, and it's just fiat currency, you're like, oh well. But if you lose your gold and silver,
yeah, that's real money. Look, JP Morgan and the Federal Reserve Bank and Jim Paplava, they can raise margin requirements to 200%. It doesn't change the fact that silver's going to 500 and JP Morgan's going to 0. That's written, it's baked into the cake.
And finally on gold, China on track to become top gold buyer. Again, this is something that we told you would happen. We said this would happen. The demand is unbelievable. The size of the orders is enormous, said one senior banker who estimated that China had imported about 200 tons of gold in 3 months. This is the Chinese citizen buying this, but in America it's becoming more and more mocked and ridiculed, as we've discussed.
They watch the show in China.
Yes.
Just like Al Jazeera, for example, is watched outside of the U.S. and could have telling the world for years what's really going on in the Middle East. It's not seen in the U.S., so the Americans are unprepared for reality. Similarly, we've been talking about gold and silver, but only those people in China who watch this show religiously have been accumulating gold and silver and will be prepared for the 21st century. People in America will be holding their fiat dollars and their Big Macs and wondering, what happened to my country?
And then finally, we have this remarkable headline because the W word has been used in a most shocking way, Max. Rand Paul, end welfare to Israel.
What?
I'm going to play a little clip for you.
And I'm not singling out Israel. I'm a supporter of Israel. I want to be known as a friend of Israel. But
not with foreign aid.
Well, you can't give money you don't have. We can't just borrow from our kids' future and give it to countries, even if they are our friends. Some people interpret this to mean, oh, you're not a friend of Israel. No, I want to be a friend of Israel. I think they're an important ally, but I also think that their per capita income is greater than probably 3/4 of the rest of the world. Should we be giving money to a free money or welfare to a rich nation? I don't think so.
Of course, that welfare, he doesn't quite identify it. It's going to Israel, but that's just a pass-through mechanism back to U.S. corporations like Boeing, like Raytheon, like other big, giant Lockheed Martin type corporations.
It's like $60 billion over the past, 2 or 3 decades. Like Mubarak.
I was going to say.
Mubarak and Israel, they're both playing the U.S. taxpayer for chumps. Basically.
Well, I think that Israel and Egypt and Jordan are fronts for the U.S. corporations seeking welfare payments. They pretend that they're, giant corporations who could stand on their own 2 feet, and they go spreading wars around the world in the name of capitalism, and yet they themselves are the biggest recipients.
Or democracy, and when it happens in Egypt, of course, the U.S. is like, oh, what's that? Democracy? We never heard of it. We're not about that. That's not us at all.
It's not consistent with our social welfare scheme, our corporate welfare scheme.
And of course, Israel being a nuclear armed state, it's illegal for them to take aid, or as Ron Paul calls it, welfare. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for once again gracing us with your presence here on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way, so stay right there. All right, welcome back to the Keiser Report. Let's go to New York and talk with investment advisor Joshua Brown, also known as the Reformed Broker. Joshua, welcome to the Keiser Report.
How's it going, Max? Good to be back.
All right, Josh, revolution is sweeping the Middle East. Would a dictator-free Middle East be bad news for Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon shares?
I think they'll always have their share of reasons to restock the military. And I also think a dictator-free Middle East is probably not in our lifetimes.
Yeah, certainly these companies have gotten tremendous subsidies by propping up the dictators in exchange for the dictators kicking back billions. It's a form of welfare in America. The other thing sweeping the world is freak weather. Let's talk about freak weather. We're seeing a once-in-a-thousand-year flood, end quote. Droughts and storms every month, it seems. What sort of impact is freak weather going to have on the equity markets and on the bond markets going forward, Joshua Brown?
Well, Max, investors have gone absolutely crazy for commodities, especially the agricultural variety, over the last couple of months. You're basically seeing dislocations in every single one of them. I'll give you a couple of for instances. You're seeing cotton at a Civil War era high. You're seeing sugar at new highs all the time. Wheat, obviously very affected by the fires and droughts last spring and summer. I think you'll see that again this year if these weather patterns continue. So you're seeing equity investors pile into investments that are levered to higher agricultural commodity prices.
Well, you used the word dislocation, but what's being dislocated here? The market's being dislocated, or are they just performing their normal price discovery mechanism while the nature itself, the ecosystem, the global ecosystem, due to the ravages of industrialization, has become dislocated? So which came first, the chicken or the egg here? What's really being dislocated? The environment, the ecosystem, or the economy?
Yeah, Max, I think we can have a little from column A and a little from column B. I think to a large part there are demand issues that are a completely new paradigm. I hate saying this, this time it's different. all of us in the investment business revile that phrase, but if you look at where the demand is coming from, you're seeing it from parts of the world where 10 years ago would not even be in the discussion. You also have easy monetary policy, which I know is a big topic on your show. There's, without a doubt, you have a lot of free, loose cash chasing commodities of all stripes as a result of that. And then you have the regular kind of supply disruptions like what I referenced with what went on with Russia with the wheat crop. You're seeing that in Australia with sugar, and that's going to happen regardless. There are some weather phenomenons, though, taking place right now, like El Nino, that do exacerbate those kind of dislocations. So I think it's like a combination.
Yeah, but the demand didn't suddenly triple. The population has been going up, but not that much. It's a supply issue. The supply of cheap money,
Sure.
the supply of quantitative easing that's giving the speculators a free pass to speculate and drive these prices higher. And then when prices go against them, they get bailed out with more quantitative easing. So who's going to stand up to the real dictator here, Ben Bernanke?
I actually think that there are some things being done in commodity markets that are positive. Number one, position limit sizing. Number two, reserve requirements being raised. Number three, changes in margin policy. I think there is a recognition amongst the futures regulators and exchanges that, left unchecked, we could be back at $150 oil and we could start having people play games with some of the narrower commodities to make life difficult for the industrial economy that actually wants to build and produce things. So it's not all bad. I think higher prices this time are going to result in a little bit of sanity and not necessarily overwrought regulation, but a sense that there do have to be some grown-ups around the exchanges before things get out of control.
Yeah, but every time they raise margin requirements or raise position limits, Bernanke just raises the quantitative easing. So, he's got his fingers on the controls. He can keep raising these things by trillions of dollars. Let me ask you something. He was on 60 Minutes recently. He said that, well, there's no problem with all this money we're creating. Within 15 minutes, I can reverse direction and subtract all this money from the economy. But isn't it like a porcupine, Joshua Brown, all this money easing? It goes in easy, but if you try to pull it out the same way it came in, you've got a lot of pain in the bond market. Is he correct to say that he can reverse course in 15 minutes, or is he speaking out of his hat, to put it mildly?
Max, since September, I've been one of the charter members in the blogosphere, at least, of the one percenters. I would love to see a rate hike, if only, from 0 to 1% is not a huge change in what it does to the economy, but I would like to see how the markets, the capital markets, withstand that, both on the bond and the stock side. I think you would absolutely get some kind of a shock, some kind of a sell-off at first, but I think we can get to that level where we're out of emergency mode. Whether or not we can really choke off commodity speculation with interest rates is yet to be seen. And, certainly I agree with your point. It's not going to be as easy as he says, flipping the switch in 15 minutes and making an adjustment.
Well, the other thing is that what he's done there by keeping rates so low to help his speculating banking buddies is he's penalized everyone who's got money in a savings account. The workers, the people on retirement, they're subsidizing Goldman Sachs bonuses, JP Morgan bonuses. It's coming out of grandma's pocket. It's coming out of grandpa's pocket to pay these young bucks on Wall Street, and we know that they're all on drugs. So, grandma and grandpa are subsidizing Wall Street's drug habit. That's not fair. Now, let's talk about, speaking of freaks, the United States, the USDA, Department of Agriculture, last week overturned a court order banning Monsanto's genetically modified sugar beet seeds. I don't know if you've been following this one, but Monsanto controls 95% of the sugar beet seed market. That's not a commodity market, that's a monopoly position. 50% of the entire market. That's not economics. That's Soviet-era monopoly position. How did this happen?
The way it happens is that you've got a situation where they're more worried about a sugar crisis, a shortage crisis, than they are about the negative ramifications of genetically modified seeds. It just so happens that Monsanto is that player. They are that size. The agricultural subsidies, the higher you see agricultural commodity prices rise, the bigger the profit margins, the more of a joke they begin to look like, from a corporate standpoint. You're talking about companies that are de facto the biggest welfare queens in the country, and now they're starting to see inordinate amounts of demand for their product. I don't know how much longer the subsidies last. I know it's very tough to get through the political process in the Midwest without, at the very least, keeping your mouth shut about them.
But it goes beyond just being anti-American in terms of Monsanto. By monopolizing the sugar beet market and the sugar market, by holding the sugar market ransom.
Corn is no better. Corn is no better.
Okay, but we're talking about a company here, Monsanto. That's not that like they've tried to corner a market. They have fiddled with the underlying ecology and genetic makeup of the food crops that have been around for 100, 200,000 years. You know, since humans have been organizing food crops, let's call it 12,000 years, you know, the beginning of agriculture. And now in the last 50 years, Monsanto comes around. It goes beyond being anti-American. They're actually being anti-God. I mean, Monsanto is the devil incarnate. They believe that their corporate mission statement takes precedence over God. I mean, who's going to take these, what's up with this company?
There's a long history of this kind of stuff, and while not being a proponent of it, I certainly look for ways to capitalize on it. I know it's not the direction we want to go, but let's keep in mind the sugar beet dependence stems from the 1800s when cane sugar became too costly to ship into other parts of the country. We also had shenanigans. The reason Hawaii became a state was in part for some of the access to sugar that the exporters there were offering. So I think Monsanto is only the last in a long line of companies that have sought to use an agricultural advantage for their political aims and profit aims.
Now let's talk about, we learned that the unemployment numbers are looking good, quote unquote. Are they really looking good, Joshua Brown, or could the government numbers just be a form of what we might call financial propaganda?
NFP is one of the noisiest, sloppiest reports we get. It's very tough to take it without a grain of salt because you know there's a revision right around the bend. I think U6 is a much more important measure to look at, and U6 is still ugly.
All right, hold on. Sorry. Let me interrupt for a second. Just break down NFP for those who are not aware of this, and U6 for those who are not aware.
Yeah, non-farm payrolls.
Okay.
Right, non-farm payrolls is basically the predominant study put out on the jobs rate, the employment rate by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The other measure that I cited, U6, is underemployment. And you're taking into account people that are working part-time jobs that want to be full-time. You're talking about people that are doing a job which is not the job that they want to do, temporary help, things of that nature. And U6 is not budging the way the headline number seems to be gradually budging on unemployment claims. So I think the numbers are really noisy. It's tough to really say with a straight face, this is an improvement. What we can say, though, things are not getting worse. And I know that's kind of like it's an easy way to tout improvement, but you know, you have to keep in mind things were so bad for so long that just a cessation in layoffs, for example, you can kind of look at it from a positive standpoint. We know what the damage has been and what will be.
All right, well, you say there's a lot of noise in the numbers. Well, let's look at what David Stockman recently said on another network. He said, look, 10 years ago, there was 136 million people with jobs in America. Today, 10 years later, 136 million people with jobs. There hasn't been any job growth in 10 years. I mean, that's a simple number. Why can't the administration just say, there's been no job growth at all in 10 years, and yet we've made a lot of people on Wall Street very, very rich by jiggling the numbers, by falsifying the numbers. We know that the 9% unemployment number they just reported doesn't include people who stopped looking for work. What kind of number is that? I mean, why don't they just, it's an insult. But you know the story there. I think most people know that those numbers are worthless.
The Dow Jones hasn't moved in 10 years either.
That's correct. There hasn't been any.
We're at 11,000.
Right. The only gainer here of any note has been, of course, gold and silver. As a money manager, have you been in the gold and silver play these last 10 years, Joshua Brown?
I've been in them along with everyone else. I'm not religious about them, but I recognize the need for investors to have some allocation toward the precious metals. I've been rejiggering the way I'm doing that. I'm coming out of the large cap miners. They've been a huge disappointment. Instead of allowing higher prices to boost profits and share prices, they've decided to enrich themselves and do secondary offerings. And so I'm looking more toward the metals themselves than any of the derivative plays right now. But yeah, I'm in them.
Yeah, finally, I did want to ask you on China, the China story here. Is it overhyped? Where are we in the China story in your view of things, Joshua Brown?
China scares me. I'm watching Chinese PMI now, 2 months, Purchasing Managers Index, now down 2 months straight. Not a trend yet, but a third month. What are we going to say? In the meantime, all the industrial and base metal commodities are skyrocketing still. Copper a fresh high this morning, as though there's no possible way you're going to get any kind of building slowdown there. China's the largest purchaser of copper in the world, by the way. So I think that people are not expecting any kind of slowdown in China, and that surprises me because the data is starting to point toward one.
All right, Joshua Brown, thanks so much again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Joshua Brown. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.